Hello and welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, Senior Writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. On today's show, I'm going to give you my start, sits, and sleepers for Week 10 of the fantasy football season. The good news is we have just a couple weeks left of the byes, Week 10 and Week 11. Then we don't have to worry about them anymore, so that's a good thing. The bad news is last week I was just okay in these picks. I was 14-12, not my best week, not my worst. Overall for the season, I'm 132 and 102 for a 56% percentage there for my win totals for the year. Not too bad. Hopefully I can do a little better this week for you. As always, I'm going to give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and a sleeper at QB, running back, receiver, and at tight end, I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper there. We'll start off with the QBs, and my first start of the week is Jackson Dart of the New York Giants. He is 3rd overall in fantasy quarterback scoring his last 3 games. He has 20-plus fantasy points every game he has played this year. He has 4 straight games with a rushing touchdown, multiple touchdowns, all 6 of his starts. He's been absolutely fantastic. He's doing this without his number 1 receiver, now without his number 1 running back. I'm just anxious to see what he can do once he gets a really good team around him. So for now, even though he is lacking some of those weapons, I still think he's a great start, especially this week against the Bears. They allowed the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. The Bears allowed nearly 500 passing yards last week in their game. My next start for the week at quarterback is Drake May of the New England Patriots. 4 straight games with 20-plus fantasy points for May. He is 4th overall in fantasy quarterback scoring for the season and 5th overall his last 3 games. He's been so consistent all year. He had another 20-plus point game against a good Falcons secondary last week. This week, better matchup. Gets the Bucs. They're middle of the pack against the pass. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game against Tampa. I think May keeps it going and has another good showing for his fantasy owners. My last start at QB is Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions. He is not having quite the huge season you would like, but he's been consistent. He had 22.2 fantasy points last week. He has 3 games this year with 20-plus fantasy points. He gets the Commanders this week, and they're reeling. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. They just lost their starting quarterback likely for the rest of the season, and they've given up 235-plus passing yards 4 straight games. I like the Lions to score a lot of points in this matchup, and I think Goff's going to have a solid Week 10. My sits at QB. My first one's Daniel Jones of the Colts. Really his first poor game of the season last week. Turned the ball over 5 times, but this was kind of one of those game script games where they got down early. They had to throw the ball a ton. Jones threw the ball 50 times. This is not a good recipe for him and success. This week against the Falcons, I think they're going to get the lead, win the game, and take the air out of the ball a little bit. I don't think Jones has a huge ceiling in this matchup. I look for the Colts to have a lot of success running the ball against Atlanta. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. They have allowed more than 200 passing yards just 1 game all year. So they've been really good against the pass. I still don't think Jones is going to be a bad play going forward, but I just don't love him in this matchup. I'm not getting too down on him over a game, but I still think he could struggle a little bit to do much for fantasy owners in Week 10. My next sit at QB is Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Good numbers the last 4 weeks for Lawrence, but he does have fewer than 15 fantasy points 3 of his first 4 games this year. He's been a little up and down. He gets the Texans this week. They are really good defensively. They allow the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. They've allowed less than 200 passing yards 5 straight games. I don't think Lawrence is going to do much in this matchup. I would leave him on my bench. My last sit for this week at quarterback is Geno Smith of the Raiders. Best game of the season last week. Had a really good game. Threw for 284 yards, 4 touchdowns, top 30 fantasy points for the first time, but don't get too high on him over a game. He's still just a streaming play at this point of the season, especially after trading away their number 1 target at receiver, Jacoby Myers. Now he gets the Broncos this week. I think he's going to come back down to earth in a big way. Denver allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. They have a very good pass rush. I think they could give Smith some trouble in this matchup, and I would steer clear of him. Don't get too high on him over 1 big performance. My sleeper at quarterback, it's J.J. McCarthy of the Minnesota Vikings. I actually had him on my sit list last week. That didn't turn out too well as he played really well. He returned from that ankle injury, and he had a 3-touchdown game. He actually has 3 touchdown games, 2 of the 3 games he has played this year. I was just a little worried about him in his first game back on the road against a good Lions team, but he showed me a lot in that game. He has 21 fantasy points 21 plus fantasy points, 2 games this season. I think he has some potential in this potent Vikings offense, especially this week against Baltimore. They allowed the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think this is going to be a high scoring game as well. I like McCarthy to have another good showing this week. Let's move on to the running back position. I'll go with the starts, as always, to start the position. And my first one is Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had his first 2-touchdown game of the season last week. He ran for just 31 yards, though, so that is concerning, but he touched the ball a ton. And he has 17 plus fantasy points, 2 of 3 games. He's getting a ton of volume in this offense. I like him to score another touchdown this week against Los Angeles Chargers. They have allowed more than 160 rushing yards 2 games this season. I think he's going to get another big workload. I think the Steelers are going to be able to score a few points in this one, and I like Warren to find the end zone, maybe twice again. I'm thinking at least 1 touchdown, but maybe he gets 2 once again, so I like him a lot for fantasy owners this week. My next start at running backs, Kyle Monangai of the Chicago Bears. DeAndre Swift, I don't know what his status is at this point of the week. I taped this on a Wednesday. I think he's going to be up in the air again, but even if he plays, I think Monangai is going to be a solid play for fantasy teams. He's going to get the ball. They're going to have like a 1A, 1B type situation. Swift's been playing well also, but Monangai showed a lot last week. He had nearly 200 total yards in his first NFL start. He has 17 plus fantasy points, 2 of 3 games. He gets the Giants. They allow the second most fantasy points for running backs on the season. Giants have allowed 192.3 rushing yards per game their last 3 games. So they're allowing nearly 200 rushing yards per game their last 3 games. I think the Bears are going to run the ball a ton. Even if Swift's active, I'm playing Monangai as well. I like him to have another good game in week 10. My next start at running backs, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. He's really a must start at this point of his career. He's been absolutely fantastic this season. 3rd overall in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games, 2 straight 100-yard games. He gets Miami this week. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to running backs, and they've traded away some more of their pieces on the defensive side of the ball, so that's not good for them there. I think the Buffalo Bills are going to run all over them. They've allowed 150 rushing yards. They allowed 150 rushing yards last week to the Ravens and have allowed at least 150 yards 5 games this year. So I like Buffalo to really have a lot of success running the ball in this matchup. Cook is a must start. My sits at running back. My first one's Breece Hall. He wanted to get traded after the Jets fire sale on Tuesday. It didn't happen. He remains a starter in this offense, but he's kind of been all over the map this year. He had his best game of the season his last time out, but that was against a brutal Bengals defense. He had fewer than 8 fantasy points 2 straight games before that huge game in week 8. Like I mentioned, he's been up and down all year. I think he has a down game this week against the Cleveland Browns. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to running backs. They're really good defensively. I think Hall is going to struggle to do much in this one. My next sit at running back is Woody Marks of the Houston Texans. Just when you thought you might be able to start trusting Marks, he's been playing well in recent weeks. He scored 2.7 fantasy points last week. He remains really a volatile fantasy play, in my opinion, for a team that struggled to run the ball throughout the year. Now he gets Jacksonville this week. They allow the 9th fewest fantasy points for running backs. The Texans ran for just 87 yards against the Jags in week 3. I don't think they're going to have much success running the ball here. I would steer clear of Marks in week 10. My last sit at running backs, Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Not sure if Bucky Irvin's going to return. As I mentioned, taping this on a Wednesday, haven't heard anything on Irvin's status just yet. But even if Irvin sits and White starts again, I'm not big on him. He has 2 straight games with fewer than 9 fantasy points, despite starting in that high-powered Bucs offense. And he gets New England this week. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs, and they have allowed less than 74 rushing yards 4 straight games. So even if White starts, I'm not big on him in week 10. My sleeper at running back is Ty Johnson of the Buffalo Bills. Johnson doesn't get much weekly work, but he gets some touches on a weekly basis. He scored a season-high 10 fantasy points last week. I think the Bills are going to absolutely blow out the Dolphins, who can't stop the run at all. I like James Cook too, but I think Johnson could be a sneaky play, getting some points in garbage time for this offense against a terrible Miami rush defense. As I mentioned earlier, they allow the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. They've allowed at least 122 rushing yards all but 2 games this year. So I think Johnson could be a sneaky play if you're looking for a flex play. Maybe if you want to do something at DFS, looking for a cheap option there, I would consider Johnson also. Let's move on to the receiver position now. We'll go with the starts. My first one is Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. Allen is actually 11th in fantasy scoring his last 3 games, 13th overall for the season, really having a big season in his return to Los Angeles. His numbers are even a little down the last 2 games, but he has at least 5 targets each of those last 2 games, so he's been getting some production there. He gets the Steelers this week. They allow the most fantasy points to receivers this year in 300-yard passing games, 3 straight and 4 of 5 games. I like the Chargers to have a lot of success throwing the ball in this one. I'm getting a lot of their pass catching options involved, including Allen. My next start at receivers, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. He was kind of quiet last week, but he had at least 11 fantasy points, 4 straight games before that showing last week. I'm not going to get too down on him over a game. I like him against the Ravens. I mentioned J.J. McCarthy as a sleeper. I think the Vikings are going to have some success throwing the ball here against the Ravens. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to receivers, and they've allowed at least 245 passing yards 4 or 5 games. I like Addison to rebound in week 10 and get it going. My last start at receivers, Troy Franklin of the Denver Broncos. So he is actually 7th in wide receiver fantasy scoring his last 3 games. He has double-digit targets 2 of 3 games. He's getting a ton of looks right now, and he's producing. He gets the Raiders this week. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to receivers. You got some receivers on a bye, maybe some people hurt. I would really consider plugging Franklin in the lineup. I think he could do well again. He's just getting a lot of volume right now, and he gets a favorable matchup in week 10. My sits at receiver, my first one's Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. He's actually been the most dependable fantasy receiver for the Bills. He has 11 fantasy points, 2 straight games, 11 plus fantasy points, 2 straight games, and 6 total for the season. But his yardage totals aren't great. So I think he's a little touchdown dependent, and I don't like him to score a touchdown this week against Miami. I already talked about how I think the Bills are going to have tons of success running the ball. So I think they might take the air out a little bit and not give Shakir many chances. So I think he's held out of the end zone this week. He did score a touchdown against Miami in week 3, but in that game, he had just 4 catches for 45 yards. So if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's not helping fantasy teams. And I'm not sure he scores this week. So I might consider benching Shakir. My next sit at receiver is DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Really tough to bench him because he's such a good, talented player. But he had a horrible game last week. 2 catches for 6 yards on 4 targets. He actually has less than 60 yards 3 straight games. So he's been a little down lately. The touchdown totals have what really helped his fantasy production because, quite frankly, he's not getting a lot of catches and yards. I'm not sure he finds the end zone this week against the Los Angeles Chargers. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to receivers, less than 135 passing yards 2 straight games. So they've been really good against the pass. I think Pittsburgh's going to struggle to throw the ball here, and I might consider actually benching Metcalf if you have better options. My last sit for this week is Chris Olave of the Saints. New starting quarterback Tyler Shugg actually might not be a great thing for Olave. He had just 3 catches for 57 yards on 4 targets last week. That was his worst fantasy game of the season, just 8.7 fantasy points. He gets Carolina this week. They've been really good defensively lately, especially against the pass. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to receivers. They've allowed less than 170 passing yards 2 of 3 games. Shut down a good Green Bay offense last week. I think Olave might struggle again in week 10. My sleeper at receiver is Darius Slayton of the New York Giants. He returned to the lineup week 8, and he has played at least 73% of the snaps, 2 straight games. He was targeted a season-high 7 times last week, caught 5 passes for 62 yards. Now he gets the Bears. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers on the season. I think the Giants are going to have success throwing the ball here. I like Slayton to maybe have his best game of the season in week 10. Let's move on to tight end, and we will go with the starts first. And my first one's Oronde Gadsden of the Los Angeles Chargers. I like Keenan Allen, as I mentioned, and I also mentioned I liked a lot of the pass catching options in the Chargers offense, and that includes Gadsden, who's been really good. He's 2nd overall in fantasy tight end scoring his last 3 games. He has at least 11 fantasy points, 4 straight games, at least 5 receptions, all 4 of those games. He gets Pittsburgh. They can't stop the tight end as well. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. I think Gadsden's a legit top 5 tight end in this matchup. My next start at tight end is Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. 2 touchdown games last time out. He has scored touchdowns 5 of 6 games. He's been a top red zone target in this Eagles offense. He is fourth in tight end scoring his last 3 games. Packers allow the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. They've struggled in that area to contain the tight end. I would not be surprised if Goddard finds the end zone once again. My sits at tight end. My first one is Tyler Warren, who's actually been really good this year, but he's kind of cooled since a hot start. He has less than double-digit fantasy points 2 straight games. He is getting the looks. He has 12 targets those 2 games, but he's not making a lot of big plays with them. His yardage production is a little down, and I think he could be held in check again this week against Atlanta. They have completely shut down fantasy tight ends this season. They are the team that you do not want your fantasy tight end to play. They allow the fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the year. Just been dynamic at stopping the tight end for whatever reason. They do a great job in that area. My next sit at tight end is Luke Musgrave of the Packers. So he gets his chance to start now with Tucker Kraft out for the season. A lot of people want to go grab him on waivers, but I don't like his matchup this week. He gets the Eagles. They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to tight ends. They have allowed less than 200 passing yards 2 of 3 games. Musgrave has started in the past, and he's always been kind of ho-hum and inconsistent for fantasy owners. So I think he's going to be more of a matchup play. You can't expect him to go in there and produce like Kraft had done this season. He was really outstanding, and I think Musgrave is a guy I'm going to use as a streamer and not in every week play, and this is not a week I want to use him. My sleeper at tight end is Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. He had 6 catches for 77 yards on 8 targets last week against a good Broncos defense. He has 11-plus fantasy points 3 of 4 games. He gets the Jags this week. They struggle to stop the tight end. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points to tight ends. Schultz had 5 catches against the same Jags team in week 3. Davis Mills looked his way often, and I think he's likely to get the start again this week with C.J. Stroud banged up with a concussion, took a nasty hit last week. So if Mills starts, I like Schultz even better. But even if Stroud's in there, I think Schultz is a good play in this matchup. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 10 of the fantasy football season. Good luck in all your games this week. Hope you come out on top. This has been Jeff Paur for Real Time Fantasy Sports.